I stood in my driveway at 6 in the morning, staring at what looked like a small mountain of mulch covering Karen Thompson's pristine white porch. Steam rose from the fresh wood chips in the cool morning air. My heart pounded as I watched her bedroom curtains twitch open. 3 months earlier, I thought I had moved into paradise, a quiet suburban neighborhood with perfect lawns and friendly neighbors. I was wrong. Karen Thompson, the HOA president, had turned my dream home into a living nightmare with her petty rules and constant harassment. But this morning was different. This morning, Karen was about to discover that sometimes the quiet neighbor fights back. As her front door flew open and her shriek pierced the peaceful morning air, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. This war was far from over. 6 months ago, I thought I had won the lottery. After years of saving and searching, I finally found my dream home in Willowbrook Estates. The neighborhood looked like something from a magazine. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see. Children rode their bikes on spotless sidewalks while neighbors waved from their front porches. The moving truck had barely pulled away when she appeared. Karen Thompson walked across the street with a clipboard in one hand and a forced smile that never reached her eyes. She was in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of outfit that screamed expensive suburban housewife. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I am Karen Thompson, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally welcome you and make sure you have all the information you need to maintain our community standards." At first, I thought she was being helpful. She handed me a thick packet of HOA rules and regulations, highlighting sections about lawn care, holiday decorations, and property maintenance. Her voice was sweet, but there was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. "Now, I noticed you have some lovely oak trees in your front yard," she continued, making notes on her clipboard. "Just remember that fall cleanup is mandatory by November 1st. We cannot have unsightly leaf piles disturbing the aesthetic of our community." I assured her that I understood and had always taken pride in maintaining my property. Karen nodded, but her eyes were scanning my yard like a hawk searching for prey. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice things. Karen would walk past my house every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, always with that same clipboard. She would stop and stare at my mailbox, my driveway, my flower beds. Then she would make notes and move on to the next house. But it was not just me. I watched from my kitchen window as Karen approached my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen. The conversation started friendly enough, but I could see Mrs. Chen's shoulders slump as Karen pointed at her garden gnomes and shook her head disapprovingly. The mailman, Dave, had been delivering to this neighborhood for 15 years. One afternoon, I caught him as he was leaving my mailbox. "That woman is something else," he said, glancing toward Karen's house. "She actually tried to tell me which side of the mailbox to approach from, said it was in the HOA regulations." Dave shook his head and walked to his truck. "I have been delivering mail for 25 years, and I have never met anyone like her. She treats this place like her personal kingdom." That evening, I stood on my front porch and really looked at my neighborhood for the first time. The perfect lawns suddenly seemed sterile. The quiet streets felt oppressive. And Karen's house, with its spotless white siding and award-winning rose garden, looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Something cold settled in my stomach as I realized what I had gotten myself into. This was not the peaceful community I had imagined. This was Karen Thompson's domain, and I was just another subject in her suburban kingdom. As I walked back inside, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing at her living room window, watching me. Even from across the street, I could see her making notes on that damn clipboard. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. October arrived with a spectacular display of autumn colors. My oak trees transformed into giants of gold and crimson, their leaves creating a natural carpet across my front yard. I had always loved fall, but living in Willowbrook Estates, I quickly learned that leaf season was serious business. Every weekend, I was out there with my rake and leaf blower, carefully collecting every single leaf that dared to fall on my property. I filled bag after bag, following the HOA guidelines to the letter. The community had specific rules about leaf disposal. They had to be bagged in approved brown paper bags, placed at the curb by 7 a.m. on collection day, and absolutely no loose leaves could remain on the lawn. I took pride in my work. By Sunday evening, my yard looked pristine. Not a single leaf remained on my grass or in my flower beds. I even swept the driveway and sidewalk to make sure everything met Karen's impossibly high standards. Meanwhile, Karen's yard was a different story. Her property had several large maple trees that dropped leaves constantly. But instead of cleaning them up, she seemed to let them blow wherever the wind took them. I watched from my kitchen window as piles of her leaves scattered across the street and into neighboring yards. When I mentioned this to my neighbor Jim, he just shrugged. "That is Karen for you," he said. "The rules apply to everyone except her." But I had no idea how right he was until that Tuesday morning in late October. I stepped outside to grab my newspaper and stopped dead in my tracks. My perfectly clean front yard was buried under what looked like several weeks' worth of leaves. Not just a few scattered leaves that might have blown over naturally, but massive piles that had clearly been dumped there on purpose. The leaves covered my flower beds, my walkway, and even my driveway. Some of them were still wet from the previous night's rain, creating soggy mounds that would be impossible to rake up cleanly. The smell of rotting vegetation filled my nostrils as I stood there in shock. I grabbed my phone and took pictures from every angle. This was not natural leaf fall. This was deliberate dumping. The leaves were piled in specific areas, as if someone had loaded them into bags and then emptied them strategically across my property. My hands shook with anger as I walked across the street to Karen's house. Her yard, I noticed, was completely spotless. Not a single leaf could be seen on her pristine grass or perfectly edged flower beds. I rang her doorbell and waited. When Karen opened the door, she was already dressed in her usual outfit of pressed khakis and a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think there has been some kind of mistake. Someone dumped leaves all over my yard last night." Karen stepped onto her porch and looked across the street at my property with theatrical concern. "Oh my," she said, pressing her hand to her chest. "That is terrible, but you know those are your leaves. They came from your oak trees." I stared at her in disbelief. "Karen, these leaves are maple leaves. I do not have any maple trees on my property." "Are you sure?" she asked, tilting her head with fake innocence. "Leaves can blow quite far in the wind, and according to Section 12 of the HOA bylaws, homeowners are responsible for all organic debris on their property, regardless of origin." "I cleaned my yard completely on Sunday," I said, holding up my phone to show her the pictures. "These leaves were dumped here on purpose." Karen's expression shifted from fake concern to cold authority. "That is a serious accusation," she said. "I hope you are not suggesting that someone in this community would engage in such behavior, because if you are, I would be happy to file a complaint with the HOA board about harassment and false accusations." I felt my blood pressure rising as I realized what was happening. Karen was not just denying responsibility, she was threatening me. Furthermore, she continued, I noticed that your yard is currently in violation of Section 12A, which states that all organic debris must be removed within 24 hours of accumulation. I will be forced to issue a citation if this is not cleaned up by tomorrow morning. She stepped back inside and closed the door, leaving me standing on her porch in complete shock. As I walked back to my house, I could see neighbors peeking out their windows. Jim gave me a sympathetic wave from his front door. Mrs. Chen shook her head sadly from her garden. But Karen was already back at her living room window, clipboard in hand, making notes about my violation. That night, I spent 3 hours cleaning up the leaves that Karen had dumped on my property. Every soggy handful felt like a piece of my dignity being stripped away. I had no idea that this was just the opening move in Karen's war against me. The first violation notice arrived 3 days later. I found it taped to my front door when I came home from work, printed on official HOA letterhead with Karen's signature at the bottom. Violation notice, property address, 1247 Maple Lane. Violation, Section 3.4 mailbox positioning. Your mailbox post is positioned 2.3 inches closer to the street than the approved 18-inch setback. Correction required by November 15th. Fine, $50 if not corrected by deadline. I stood in my driveway, reading the notice 3 times before the absurdity sank in. She had measured my mailbox with a ruler, the same mailbox that had been in the exact same position when I bought the house 6 months earlier. But that was just the beginning. The next day brought another notice. This time, it was about my grass height. According to Karen's measurements, my lawn was 3.2 inches tall, which violated the HOA rule requiring grass to be maintained between 2.5 and 3 inches. By the end of the week, I had received 5 more violations. My holiday wreath was not in accordance with approved seasonal decorations. My garbage cans were visible from the street for approximately 4 minutes longer than the allowed pickup window. My car was parked 1.7 inches over the property line in my own driveway. Each violation came with a $50 fine and a deadline for correction. More importantly, each violation was signed by Karen Thompson and co-signed by 2 other HOA board members, Patricia Wells and Robert Martinez. I had never met Patricia or Robert, but apparently they were willing to rubber stamp whatever Karen put in front of them. The harassment was not limited to violation notices. Karen began walking past my house multiple times per day, always with her clipboard and measuring tape. She would stop at my mailbox, measure the distance to the street, and make notes. Then she would measure my grass with a ruler, photograph my garbage cans, and document the exact position of my car in my driveway. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact when they saw me outside. I could not blame them. They had seen what Karen was capable of, and they did not want to become her next target. I tried calling the HOA management company to file a complaint, but they told me that all complaints had to be submitted in writing to the board. When I asked for the board's contact information, they gave me Karen's email address. I spent hours researching HOA law and reading through every page of the community bylaws. What I discovered made my blood boil. The rules that Karen was using against me were buried in subsections and appendices. They were vague enough to be interpreted however she wanted and comprehensive enough to cover almost any aspect of daily life. But the most infuriating part was the appeals process. According to the bylaws, Any violation could be appealed to the full HOA board, but the board consisted of Karen, Patricia, and Robert. Essentially, I would be appealing Karen's decisions to Karen herself. The financial pressure was becoming real. With fines accumulating daily, I was looking at hundreds of dollars in penalties for violations that ranged from meaningless to completely fabricated. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by violation notices and HOA bylaws, my phone rang. It was Jim from next door. "I am sorry this is happening to you," he said quietly. "She did the same thing to the family who lived in your house before you. They ended up selling and moving away just to escape the harassment." "How long did it go on?" I asked. 2 years, Jim replied. 2 years of constant violations, fines, and board meetings. They were good people, but Karen made their lives hell. After I hung up, I sat in my dark kitchen and stared across the street at Karen's house. Every light was on, and I could see her silhouette moving from room to room. That night, I made a decision. I was not going to be another family driven away by Karen Thompson's power trip, but I also was not going to keep playing by her rigged rules. It was time to change the game entirely. I spent the next 3 weeks becoming an expert on everything Karen Thompson did not want me to know. Every evening after work, I buried myself in HOA law, state regulations, and legal precedents. I read case studies of homeowners who had fought back against abusive HOA boards and won. But more importantly, I started documenting everything Karen did. I set up a security camera system that recorded my entire front yard and the street in front of my house. I created a detailed log of every violation notice, every interaction with Karen, and every instance of her measuring and photographing my property. Then I started watching Karen's house with the same obsessive attention she had been giving mine. What I discovered was fascinating. Karen's perfect yard and pristine house were hiding a multitude of violations that she had been ignoring for years. Her fence was 6 inches taller than the HOA maximum height requirement. She had installed landscape lighting that violated the community's dark sky policy. Her driveway had been resurfaced with a material that was not on the approved list. Most notably, she had built a decorative stone border around her flower beds without submitting the required architectural modification request. I photographed everything. I measured her fence with the same obsessive precision she had used on my mailbox. I documented her violations with the same bureaucratic thoroughness she had applied to my grass height. But I needed more than just documentation. I needed legal advice. My college roommate, Mike, had become a real estate attorney in the city. When I called him and explained my situation, his first response was laughter. "You are not going to believe this," he said, "but I have been dealing with HOA cases for 10 years, and yours is a textbook example of selective enforcement and harassment. The documentation you have gathered is actually incredible. Most people do not think to record everything until it is too late." Mike reviewed my photos, violation notices, and timeline of events. His assessment was better than I had hoped. "She has made several critical mistakes," he explained. "First, she is selectively enforcing rules that she is violating herself. Second, she is using her position to harass you personally rather than enforce community standards fairly. Third, the frequency and nature of the violations suggest a pattern of retaliation rather than legitimate enforcement." But Mike also warned me about the reality of legal action. "You could absolutely win a lawsuit against the HOA," he said, "but it would take months, cost thousands of dollars, and create years of ongoing conflict. Sometimes the best revenge is more creative than legal." That conversation planted the seed of an idea that would grow into something beautiful. I started thinking about poetic justice. Karen had dumped leaves on my property, forcing me to spend hours cleaning up her mess. What if I returned the favor in a way that was perfectly legal but impossible to ignore? The idea came to me during a sleepless night in early December. I was lying in bed, listening to the wind blow through my oak trees, when I remembered a conversation with my landscaper about mulch delivery. Mulch was considered a landscaping material. Ordering mulch for your property was completely legal and actually encouraged by most HOA communities. The delivery of mulch was a normal part of property maintenance. But what if the mulch was delivered to the wrong address by mistake? I spent the next week researching mulch suppliers and delivery policies. What I learned was perfect for my plan. Most companies required specific delivery instructions, but mistakes happened all the time. If a customer provided unclear directions, or if the delivery driver made an error in interpretation, the mulch could end up in unexpected places. And once mulch was delivered, it became the property owner's responsibility to deal with it, regardless of whether they had ordered it or not. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would order a large quantity of mulch for landscaping projects around my property, but due to unclear delivery instructions, some of that mulch might accidentally end up on Karen's pristine front porch instead of in my yard. It was legal, it was proportional, and it would send a message that Karen could not ignore or misinterpret. I called Henderson Mulch Supply and spoke with their dispatcher about delivery options. They offered bulk mulch in quantities ranging from 1 cubic yard to 20 cubic yards. When I asked about their largest delivery truck, the dispatcher chuckled. "Our biggest truck carries 15 cubic yards," he said. "That is enough mulch to cover about 600 square feet, 3 inches deep. It makes quite an impression when we dump it." I scheduled the delivery for the following Tuesday at 8 in the morning. Karen would be finishing her daily neighborhood patrol at exactly that time, which meant she would have a front row seat for the show. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of calm settle over me for the first time in months. Karen Thompson was about to learn that some neighbors fight back. Tuesday morning arrived with crystal clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s. Perfect weather for a mulch delivery. I had barely slept the night before, running through every detail of my plan and every possible outcome. At 7:30, I positioned myself at my living room window with a cup of coffee and my phone ready to record. Karen appeared right on schedule, clipboard in hand, beginning her daily inspection tour of the neighborhood. She started with Mrs. Chen's house, making notes about something in the elderly woman's flower bed. Then she moved to Jim's property, measuring the distance between his garbage cans and the curb. Finally, she walked across the street toward my house. But before Karen could reach my mailbox, the rumble of a diesel engine echoed through the quiet neighborhood. A massive dump truck with Henderson Mulch Supply painted on the side turned onto our street. I watched Karen's face as the truck approached. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm as the driver pulled up in front of her house and began backing the truck up her driveway. The driver was a middle-aged man named Tony who had seemed perfectly pleasant when I spoke with him on the phone the day before. I had been very specific about the delivery address. The white house with the rose garden at the corner of Maple Lane and Oak Street. I had also mentioned that the homeowner might not be expecting the delivery and could seem surprised. Karen rushed toward the truck, waving her clipboard frantically. "Excuse me," she shouted over the engine noise. "There has been some mistake. I did not order any mulch." Tony rolled down his window and consulted his clipboard. "Delivery for 1243 Maple Lane," he called back. 15 cubic yards of premium hardwood mulch. Where do you want it? "I am telling you there has been a mistake," Karen insisted. "I did not order this mulch. You need to take it back." Tony shrugged apologetically. "Sorry, lady, but once I start the hydraulics, this mulch is getting dumped somewhere. Company policy. If there is a problem with the order, you will need to call the office." Karen pulled out her phone and started dialing frantically. But it was barely 8 in the morning, and Henderson Mulch Supply would not open their office until 9. Meanwhile, Tony had finished positioning his truck. The massive dump bed was angled directly over Karen's front porch and walkway. "Last chance," Tony called out. "Where do you want this mulch?" "I do not want it anywhere," Karen screamed. "Take it back to wherever you got it." Tony hit the hydraulic switch. What happened next was absolutely beautiful. 15 cubic yards of premium hardwood mulch began cascading from the truck bed like a brown waterfall. The mulch formed a perfect pyramid directly in front of Karen's pristine white front door, completely blocking her walkway and covering her porch stairs. The smell of fresh wood chips filled the air as the mulch continued to pour. Karen stood frozen in horror as her perfect entrance was buried under tons of landscaping material. Neighbors started emerging from their houses to see what the commotion was about. Jim appeared on his front porch with a coffee mug, trying unsuccessfully to hide his grin. Mrs. Chen peered out from behind her curtains. Even the mailman, Dave, stopped his truck to watch the spectacle. Within minutes, the delivery was complete. Karen's front porch had been transformed from a showcase of suburban perfection into a mulch mountain that reached nearly to her front door handle. Tony climbed down from his truck and handed Karen a delivery receipt. "Sign here, please," he said cheerfully. "I am not signing anything," Karen snarled. "This is sabotage. This is vandalism. I am calling the police." "That is your choice, ma'am," Tony replied. "But the mulch has been delivered as requested. Have a nice day." As Tony drove away, Karen stood in front of her house in complete shock. The mulch pile was enormous, blocking her front door and covering her carefully maintained flower beds. Some of the mulch had scattered across her lawn, creating brown patches on her perfect green grass. But the most beautiful part was the silence. For the first time since I had moved to Willowbrook Estates, Karen Thompson was speechless. I watched from my window as she tried to process what had just happened. Her face cycled through confusion, rage, and dawning realization. She knew exactly who was responsible for this delivery mistake, but she could not prove it. Slowly, Karen turned and looked directly at my house. Even from across the street, I could see the fury in her eyes. She raised her phone and took a picture of my house, then started typing what I assumed was an angry text message. But then something even better happened. Jim started laughing. At first, it was just a quiet chuckle, but it grew louder and more sustained. Soon, Mrs. Chen was giggling from her window. Even Dave, the mailman, was shaking his head with amusement as he drove away. The entire neighborhood was witnessing Karen's humiliation, and they were enjoying every minute of it. As I watched Karen stomp toward her front door, stepping carefully around the edges of the mulch pile, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over me. For 3 months, she had made my life miserable with her petty harassment and power trips. Now, Karen Thompson had a front yard full of premium hardwood mulch to remind her that some neighbors fight back. Karen's front door slammed so hard that I could hear it from across the street. For exactly 4 minutes, the neighborhood was blissfully quiet except for the sound of neighbors whispering to each other and the occasional chuckle from Jim's front porch. Then Karen's door flew open again, and she marched across the street toward my house with the fury of a woman who had finally reached her breaking point. I was ready for her. I opened my front door before she could ring the bell and stepped onto my porch with my coffee mug, projecting the calm confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. "Good morning, Karen," I said pleasantly. "Beautiful day, is it not?" "You did this," she hissed, pointing an accusatory finger at my chest. "You ordered that mulch and had it delivered to my house. This is harassment. This is vandalism. This is criminal destruction of property." I took a sip of my coffee and tilted my head thoughtfully. "I am sorry, but I have no idea what you are talking about. Are you feeling all right? You seem upset." Karen's face turned a shade of red that I had never seen before. "Do not play dumb with me," she screamed. "I know exactly what you did. You think you are so clever, but I am going to have you arrested for this." By now, her shouting had attracted an audience. Jim had walked down to the edge of his property to get a better view. Mrs. Chen had come outside with her watering can, pretending to tend her plants while listening to every word. Even Patricia Wells, one of Karen's fellow HOA board members, had emerged from her house 2 doors down. "Karen," I said in my most reasonable voice, "I understand you are upset about the mulch delivery, but that has nothing to do with me. Perhaps you should call the mulch company and ask them to correct their mistake." "Their mistake," Karen shrieked. "You think I am stupid. You think I do not know that you planned this whole thing." "I think you are having a very stressful morning," I replied calmly. "But accusing your neighbors of criminal activity without any evidence is probably not the best way to handle the situation." That was when Karen completely lost control. "Evidence?" she screamed. "I will show you evidence. I have been documenting every single thing you do. I have photographs of your violations. I have measurements of your mailbox. I have records of every time you break the HOA rules." She was waving her clipboard frantically, and papers were flying everywhere. Her carefully styled hair was coming undone, and her expensive outfit was wrinkled from her frantic gesturing. "You want to play games," she continued. "Fine. I am going to make your life hell. I am going to inspect every inch of your property every single day. I am going to find violations that you never even dreamed existed. I am going to fine you until you are bankrupt." Jim cleared his throat loudly. "Karen," he called out, "maybe you should calm down. The whole neighborhood can hear you." Karen spun around to face him with wild eyes. "Stay out of this, Jim. This does not concern you." "Actually, it does concern me," Jim replied. "And Mrs. Chen, and Patricia, and everyone else who has been watching you harass our new neighbor for months." Mrs. Chen nodded vigorously. "She is right to defend herself," the elderly woman said in her soft voice. "You have been very mean to her." Even Patricia Wells was looking uncomfortable. "Karen," she said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this privately at the next board meeting." But Karen was beyond reasoning. "I am the president of this HOA," she shouted. "I do not need to discuss anything with anyone. I make the rules here, and everyone will follow them or face the consequences." That was the moment when Karen revealed her true nature to the entire neighborhood. Her mask of suburban respectability had completely fallen away, leaving behind the petty tyrant that she had always been. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee and watching Karen destroy her own reputation in real time. Every word she spoke was making my case better than any lawyer could have. "Furthermore," Karen continued, "I am calling the police right now to report this vandalism." She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. The entire neighborhood watched in fascination, as she tried to convince the dispatcher that a mulch delivery constituted a criminal emergency. The conversation did not go well for Karen. "What do you mean it is not a police matter?" she screamed into the phone. "Someone dumped 15 cubic yards of mulch on my property without my permission." There was a long pause as the dispatcher apparently explained something to Karen that she did not want to hear. "No, I do not want to file a civil complaint," she snapped. "I want them arrested for vandalism." Another pause. "Fine," Karen said finally. "I will handle this myself." She hung up the phone and glared at me with pure hatred. "This is not over," she hissed. Then she stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard that her decorative wreath fell to the ground. The neighborhood was silent for a moment. Then Jim started clapping slowly. Mrs. Chen joined in. Soon, half the street was applauding. As I waved to my neighbors and went back inside, I knew that Karen Thompson's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The rest of Tuesday was gloriously peaceful. I watched from my windows as Karen spent the entire day trying to move the mulch mountain from her front porch. She had called 3 different landscaping companies, but none of them were available for emergency mulch removal on such short notice. By evening, Karen had managed to clear a narrow path to her front door using a shovel and several garbage bags. But the bulk of the mulch remained, creating a brown monument to her humiliation that would be visible to the entire neighborhood for days. Wednesday brought the first sign that things were changing in Willowbrook Estates. Instead of her usual morning inspection tour, Karen stayed inside her house. For the first time in months, I did not see her clipboard, her measuring tape, or her disapproving frown. But more importantly, my neighbors started talking to me again. Jim knocked on my door Wednesday evening with a bottle of wine and a huge grin. "I do not know how you managed that mulch delivery," he said, "but it was the most beautiful thing I have seen in years." Mrs. Chen stopped by Thursday morning with homemade cookies and a confession. "She made me remove my garden gnomes," the elderly woman said sadly. "They have been in my yard for 15 years, but she said they violated the aesthetic standards." Over the next few days, I learned that Karen's harassment campaign had affected almost every household in the neighborhood. The family with young children had been fined for leaving bicycles in their driveway overnight. The retired couple at the end of the street had been forced to repaint their shutters because Karen decided the color was not in accordance with approved earth tones. But now, emboldened by Karen's public meltdown, neighbors were finally speaking up. On Friday, I received a call from Patricia Wells, one of the other HOA board members. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Can you meet me at the community center tomorrow morning?" The meeting was eye-opening. Patricia had been serving on the HOA board for 3 years, but she had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's aggressive enforcement tactics. "She has been using her position to settle personal grudges," Patricia explained. "The violation notices, the selective enforcement, the constant harassment. None of this is what the HOA was designed to do." Patricia had been quietly documenting Karen's behavior for months. She had copies of every violation notice, records of every board meeting, and testimonials from neighbors who had been harassed. "With your permission," she said, "I would like to call a special board meeting to address Karen's conduct. The management company needs to see what has been happening here." The special board meeting took place the following Tuesday in the community center. Nearly 30 neighbors attended, filling the small room beyond capacity. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, still carrying her clipboard and wearing her usual expression of righteous authority. But the mood in the room was different. For the first time, Karen was facing a united front of neighbors who were no longer afraid of her retaliation. One by one, residents stood up to share their stories of harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of power. Mrs. Chen spoke about her garden gnomes. Jim described the daily inspections and frivolous violations. The young family talked about the stress of constantly worrying about bicycle placement and chalk drawings on sidewalks. When it was my turn, I presented my documentation of Karen's own violations, along with the timeline of harassment I had experienced since moving to the neighborhood. Karen tried to defend herself, but her arguments fell flat. She claimed she was just enforcing community standards, but the evidence of selective enforcement was overwhelming. She accused neighbors of conspiring against her, but their testimonials were too consistent and detailed to dismiss. The management company representative took detailed notes and promised a full investigation. Within 2 weeks, Karen Thompson was removed from her position as HOA president. The new board, led by Patricia Wells, implemented fair and transparent enforcement policies. Violation notices became rare and were issued only for legitimate health and safety concerns. The daily inspections stopped. The measuring tape and clipboard disappeared. My mulch pile had long since been spread across my flower beds, creating beautiful landscaping that enhanced my property value. Karen's mulch, on the other hand, had been hastily shoveled into bags and hauled away, leaving brown stains on her perfect white porch. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates felt like the community I had originally hoped to join. Children played in their driveways without fear of violations. Neighbors waved to each other without worrying about clipboard documentation. Garden gnomes returned to Mrs. Chen's yard. As for Karen Thompson, she rarely emerged from her house anymore. Her daily inspection tour had ended, and her iron grip on neighborhood life had been broken. Sometimes, I reflected, the best revenge is not just getting even. It is creating positive change that benefits everyone. The mulch had been more than just a prank. It had been a catalyst that freed an entire community from the tyranny of one person's need for control.